The Galactic Conclave had been meeting for 3,000 years. 3,000 years of agreements, treaties, wars, trade routes, and the slow, careful dance of civilizations trying not to destroy each other. 12 species. 12 flags. 12 voices around a table so massive that the light from one end took nearly a full second to reach the other. The table itself was a statement, carved from the crystallized remains of a dead star, polished by the hands of 100,000 workers from a dozen worlds, placed at the center of Station Bareth, a structure so large it had its own gravity, its own weather systems, and its own politics. Humanity had been sitting at that table for exactly 47 years. 47 years since the Conclave had found the small blue planet tucked in an unremarkable corner of the Milky Way, orbiting an average yellow star that nobody had bothered to look at closely. 47 years since a Velhari scout ship had picked up strange electromagnetic signals pulsing from the third rock in a quiet solar system and reported back to command. There is something here, but it is very small. Very small. That was the word they used. Not intelligent. Not interesting. Not dangerous. Small. Ambassador Lena Cole sat at the far end of the conclave table in a chair that had been built specifically for human proportions, smaller than every other chair at the table, lower to the ground, as though the architects had quietly communicated everything that needed to be communicated about humanity's place here, without saying a single word. Lena was 44 years old, sharp-faced, brown-skinned, with close-cropped gray hair that she'd earned through 12 years of negotiations that would have broken most people. She wore the deep blue uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, a silver pin on her lapel in the shape of Earth, a small, blue circle, quiet and easy to miss. She had learned over the years to be comfortable being easy to miss. Across the table, the Velhari representative, Ambassador Sorvin, was speaking. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his pale blue exoskeleton catching the light as he moved, his 4 upper limbs gesturing in the broad, sweeping patterns that indicated formal address among his people. His translator bead pulsed soft gold at his throat. The matter before the conclave today, Sorvin said, is the continued expansion of the Rethian Combine into Sector 9. The Combine has been warned twice. The conclave's patience is not without limit. The Rethian representative, a massive gray-furred creature called Vorg, rumbled from the other side of the table. The Combine does not recognize Sector 9 as protected territory. The resource claims they were filed improperly. We have documentation. Your documentation, said the Dasari ambassador, a slender silver-scaled being named Thresh, was filed after the fact. The conclave's records are clear. Lena listened. She always listened. She had learned that listening was the most powerful tool she had at this table, because most of the other ambassadors were so busy performing power that they forgot to absorb information. She watched the body language, the micro-expressions, the small tells that transcended species, the way Vorg's fur bristled when he was uncertain, the way Sorvin's left upper limb dropped slightly when he was bluffing, the way Thresh touched the silver scales at his throat when he was nervous. She said nothing. Because here was the truth that Lena Cole had understood since her first day at this table. Humanity's seat here was symbolic. The Conclave had invited Earth to join not because they respected humanity, not because they feared humanity, not because humanity brought anything of particular military or economic value to the table. They had invited Earth because the Conclave's charter required unanimous representation of all known sapient species in the explored galaxy, and ignoring humanity entirely would have created a paperwork problem. That was it. Humanity was here because of a paperwork problem. Lena's aide, a young man named Marcus Webb, leaned close to her ear. He was 26, dark-eyed, intensely earnest, and had been assigned to her 6 months ago fresh out of the diplomatic academy on Earth. He was still in the phase where he thought things could be changed quickly. "Ambassador," he whispered, "aren't you going to say something? The Rethian Combine's expansion directly threatens the trade lanes we use for the Kepler colony shipments. If Sector 9 falls under Combine control..." "I know," Lena said quietly. "Then, watch," she said. Marcus sat back, confused but obedient. He would learn. The debate continued for another 2 hours. In the end, The Conclave issued a formal warning to the Rethyan Combine, the third such warning, which everyone at the table knew would be ignored exactly as thoroughly as the first two. The Kepler colony trade lanes were not mentioned. Human interests were not mentioned. At one point, Sorvin referred to the minor systems in the outer territories, which was the Velhari diplomatic way of saying Earth and its colonies, and not a single other ambassador reacted because everyone understood that the minor systems were just that, minor. When the session ended and the great curved doors of the chamber slid open, Lena stood, straightened her jacket, and walked out with the measured pace she had practiced for years. Around her, the other ambassadors moved in clusters, talking, gesturing, making the real decisions in the hallways that would never appear in the official transcripts. Nobody stopped to talk to her. Nobody made eye contact. The Velhari ambassador's aide, a young blue-shelled creature who couldn't have been more than a decade out of the larval stage, glanced at her as she passed, and then looked away with a particular brand of polite disinterest that was somehow worse than open contempt. Marcus caught up with her in the corridor. He stopped, searching for the right word. Tuesday, Lena said. That was Tuesday, Marcus. How do you stand it? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. Outside the corridor's transparent wall, Station Vareth stretched away in all directions, a city in space, built over centuries, layer upon layer of civilization stacked on top of itself. Ships moved through the docking lanes in their hundreds, Velhari battlecruisers painted in their pale blue heraldry, Dasari trade vessels gleaming like silver fish, Rethyan combined freighters the size of small moons hauling resources from a dozen conquered or annexed worlds. And there, at the very edge of the civilian docking sector, small and quiet and easily overlooked, the TDS Resolute, humanity's diplomatic vessel. It was a fine ship by Earth standards. By Conclave standards, it was roughly the size of a Velhari captain's personal shuttle. I stand it, Lena said, because I know something they don't. Marcus looked at her. What's that? She watched the Resolute through the glass for a moment. Then she turned and kept walking. Not yet, she said. But soon. Marcus didn't know what she meant. He wouldn't know for another 18 months, when the thing that Lena Cole had been quietly, carefully, patiently building for 12 years finally became impossible to hide. But that comes later. First, you need to understand how humanity got here. Not to the Conclave, that part you know, but to the place where 500,000 dreadnoughts became a thing that needed to exist. That story starts a long time before Lena Cole was born. It starts with fear. Humanity had always been afraid. This was not a weakness. The other species of the Conclave had never quite understood this, because most of them had evolved in environments where they were the apex. The Velhari had no natural predators on their home world. The Dasari were ocean creatures who had dominated their seas so completely that the concept of prey existed only in their very oldest mythologies. The Rethians were so large and so physically powerful that their evolutionary history contained a gap of nearly 200,000 years where nothing on their planet had even tried to challenge them. Humans had evolved on a world that was, by any reasonable measure, trying to kill them at all times. Ice ages. Droughts. Predators faster, stronger, and better armed by nature than any human being. Diseases that could sweep through populations with terrifying speed. Competing tribes of their own kind, equally desperate, equally dangerous. Humans had never had the luxury of assuming they were safe. Every human brain, shaped by millions of years of evolution on a planet that did not care whether they lived or died, had been built around a core of constant, vigilant, adaptive fear. And fear, it turned out, was one of the most powerful engines of creativity that the universe had ever produced. Because fear makes you prepare. Fear makes you build walls and then better walls, and then walls that could move. Fear makes you study your enemies until you understand them better than they understand themselves. Fear makes you run scenarios in your head at 3 a.m, playing out every possible way things could go wrong so that when they do go wrong, you've already thought about it. Fear makes you build things. Ships. Weapons. Shields. Contingency plans inside, contingency plans inside, contingency plans. Humans had been building contingency plans since before they had language to describe them. The Velhari had a saying, an old one from their early spacefaring age, that translated roughly as, "The small creature shakes before the storm, and after the storm, the small creature is gone." It was a proverb about fragility, about how small things don't survive big forces. They had not imagined, not even for a moment, that the small creature might spend every quiet day between storms building a bunker. The United Earth Defense Initiative had been established 23 years ago, in the 7th year of humanity's conclave membership, by a joint resolution of the Terran Parliament that had passed so quietly and with so little fanfare that most humans hadn't noticed it. The resolution was titled, in the dry bureaucratic language that governments use when they want something important to sound boring, Framework for Independent Terran Security Capacity Development, Clause 7, Addendum B. Nobody paid much attention to Clause 7, Addendum B. That was exactly the point. Director James Harker had run the UEDI for 16 years. He was 61 years old, built like someone who had once been athletic and had gradually been compressed by decades of desk work and worry into something denser and more solid, with white hair cropped close and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had stared at very large problems for a very long time. He was sitting in his office on Lunar Base 7 when his comm chimed and Lena Cole's face appeared on the screen. "How was the session?" he asked. "The usual," she said. Sorvin performed for 40 minutes. Vorg threatened twice, without technically threatening. Thresh was nervous about something he didn't say. The Kepler lanes came up in no capacity whatsoever. "And our seat at the table?"
"Warm," she said.
"Still warm." A pause.
"James."
"How are we doing?" He leaned back in his chair. Through the window behind him, the lunar surface stretched away, gray and still and ancient, with Earth hanging in the black sky above it, blue and white and impossibly beautiful. He looked at it for a moment, the way he always did when she asked him this question, as though the planet itself was a reminder of why the answer mattered. "We're ahead of schedule," he said. Division 7 completed their 3rd hull series last month. The Kepler shipyards finished the new dry dock. Titan is fully operational and producing at 112% of projected capacity. "How many?" "As of this morning?" He picked up a data pad and looked at the number, even though he knew it by heart. He just liked to look at it. 487,216. Lena was quiet for a moment. "And the crews? Training? All of them. We've been running the rotation programs for 8 years now. Every Terran Defense Force pilot who qualifies goes through the program, and the qualifying standards have been," he smiled slightly, "quietly adjusted upward every year for the past 6 years. We have enough." "The Conclave can't know," she said. "The Conclave doesn't know," he said. "We've been very careful. Everything is registered as civilian infrastructure, the shipyards, the supply chains, the fuel depots. The hulls are listed as freight vessels in the outer registry. Nobody looks closely at freight vessels in the outer registry. Sorvin's intelligence division looks closely at everything. Not at things they've already decided aren't worth looking at," Harker said. "That's been our greatest protection all along. They don't look at us because they don't think we matter. And they won't look until it's too late to matter whether they look." Lena nodded slowly. "How long?" Harker set down the data pad. 13 months to full complement. 18 months to full crew readiness. If everything goes to plan, and I don't want to jinx anything, Lena, we will be ready. Then I need to keep them uninterested in us for 18 more months, she said. "You're good at that." "I'm tired of being good at that," she said. But she said it without bitterness, just the flat statement of a fact, the way you might say it's cold outside or the shuttle is late. Just a thing that was true. 18 months, Harker said. 18 months, she agreed. The screen went dark. In a small conference room 3 corridors away from the conclave chamber, the Velhari ambassador Sorvin was meeting with 2 of his intelligence staff. The room was swept for listening devices twice a day, standard procedure, and the conversation was conducted in Old High Velhari, a ceremonial language that fewer than 3,000 living beings understood. "The Terran ambassador," said the first intelligence officer, a compact being named Ress, "continues to demonstrate minimal engagement in conclave proceedings. Her influence over other delegations remains statistically negligible. The human colony at Kepler has not grown beyond projected parameters. Their defensive assets and home system consist of, she consulted her data crystal, 47 warships of varying classes, none exceeding the mass equivalent of a Velhari third-tier cruiser. They are not a factor, said the second officer. They are not a factor, Russ agreed. Sorvin was quiet for a moment, looking out the small viewport at the slow movement of ships through Veritha's docking lanes. He watched a Terran freight hauler, a boxy, inelegant thing, maneuver carefully into a civilian berth. Keep a routine eye, he said finally. Standard protocol for minor species. Standard protocol, Russ confirmed. Nobody in that room would think about humanity again for almost a year. Back on the TDS Resolute, in her small private cabin that smelled faintly of recycled air and the instant coffee she drank too much of, Lena Cole sat at her desk and looked at a photograph. It was old, printed on actual paper, which almost nobody did anymore. A family picture. A woman in her 50s, a man the same age, and between them 2 children, a girl of about 12 and a boy of about 9. They were standing in front of a house. There were trees behind the house, and the sky was that particular impossible blue that only happened on Earth in the middle of summer. The girl in the photograph was Lena. The people on either side of her were her parents, David and Ruth Cole, both of whom had worked in the Terran Agricultural Ministry their whole lives, growing food on reclaimed land in what used to be called Kansas. People who had never once in their lives sat at a conclave table or been invisible to 3-meter-tall ambassadors or stood in corridors where nobody made eye contact. People who had believed, with the uncomplicated certainty of people who had not yet been told they should stop believing it, that their children could matter. Lena looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she put it face down on her desk, the way she always did when she had work to do, because looking at it while she worked made her too human. And being too human here was not yet an advantage. Not yet, she thought. But soon. The thing about being underestimated is that it gives you time. Time to think. Time to build. Time to do the slow, unglamorous, unnoticed work that doesn't look like anything until suddenly it looks like everything. Humanity had been given a great deal of time. Not on purpose. Nobody at the conclave had sat down and decided to give humans space to develop. It was simpler and more careless than that. The other species had simply looked at Earth and its people and calculated, consciously or not, that there was no rush. That whatever humans were doing out in their little corner of the galaxy, it wasn't important enough to monitor closely, wasn't growing fast enough to be a concern, wasn't fundamentally something that needed to be taken seriously. They had made this calculation based on what they could see. What they couldn't see was everything that mattered. The Kepler shipyards were not called shipyards in any official document. They were listed in the Terran Registry of Commercial Infrastructure as the Kepler Deep Space Resource Processing and Logistics Hub, a designation so boring that even the humans who worked there occasionally forgot what they were actually building. The facility sprawled across 3 asteroid bodies in the Kepler system, connected by pressurized transit tubes and magnetic freight lines, with the main production complex buried deep inside the largest asteroid, 2 kilometers of solid rock between the work and the stars above, invisible to every sensor sweep that didn't know exactly what to look for. Chief Engineer Rosa Delgado had been running production at Kepler for 9 years. She was 53, small and precise, with dark eyes that missed nothing and hands that bore the particular scars and calluses of someone who had spent decades working with heavy industrial equipment. She had grown up in a port city on Earth's Pacific coast, daughter of a cargo loader and a systems mechanic, and she had gone into engineering the way water goes downhill because it was the natural direction for someone built the way she was built. She had not known, when she took the job at Kepler, what the job actually was. The recruiter had been careful. The paperwork had been thorough. She'd spent 3 months thinking she was signing on to manage a real logistics hub before the day that Director Harker himself had appeared on her comm screen, introduced himself, told her what she was actually building, and asked her a single question. Do you want to be part of this? She had not asked why. She had not asked whether it was legal, or ethical, or possible. She had looked at the schematics he sent her, the first schematics, just rough outlines of what they were planning, numbers that seemed absurd, and she had done the engineering math in her head with the automatic, casual speed of someone who had been doing engineering math since she was old enough to count, and she had said, "We're going to need bigger asteroid." Harker had laughed. We have 3.
We'll need more, she'd said. But yes.
I'm in. That had been 9 years ago. Since then, Rosa Delgado had turned 3 asteroid bodies and a dream into the most productive shipyard in human history, a shipyard that, to anyone looking at the official records, did not exist. The ships they built were called dreadnoughts, but that word had been chosen carefully, not for drama but for accuracy. They were not the graceful, elegant vessels that the Velhari preferred, long and pale and swooping, like enormous deep-sea creatures translated into metal. They were not the ornate, jewel-like Dasari trade ships, built to be beautiful because the Dasari believed that beauty was itself a kind of power. They were not the massive, brutish Rethyan war barges, which were essentially flying fortresses, designed to be so overwhelming in size that they could win battles before they started. Terran Dreadnoughts were built by human engineers for human pilots, and they reflected, in their design, everything that human evolution had spent millions of years building into their creators. They were adaptable. Every major system had 3 redundancies. Every hull section could be sealed independently if another section was breached. Every weapon system could be operated manually if the automated targeting went down. Every engine configuration could be recalibrated mid-flight by a single engineer with the right tools. The ships were not elegant. They were not beautiful. They were not overwhelming in any single dimension. They were just extraordinarily, almost obsessively, hard to kill. And they were fast. Not faster than Velhari warships in a straight line. The Velhari drove technology had been refined over centuries. But faster in direction changes, faster in response time, built for the kind of 3-dimensional maneuvering that a species of ground-dwelling, tool-using, problem-solving primates had been doing in fighter craft since the 20th century. Human pilots had an almost instinctive relationship with 3-dimensional movement that other species, Rosa had come to understand, simply didn't share. The Velhari thought in 2 dimensions, up and down, forward and back, because their homeworld's terrain had shaped their spatial intuition over millions of years. The Rethians thought in mass and momentum because those were the only tools that had ever mattered in their evolutionary history. Humans thought in every direction simultaneously because their ancestors had lived in an environment where danger could come from any angle, at any time, and the only way to survive was to track all of it at once. It made them terrifying pilots. It also made them terrifying engineers. Rosa walked the production floor of Section C, one of 7 production sections in the Kepler facility, and watched a dreadnought hull take shape. The ship was immense up close, though that was difficult to convey in a way that translated into awe because human brains were very good at scaling. Standing next to a Terran Dreadnought and feeling how large it was required a kind of deliberate mental effort, a conscious recalibration of scale that reminded you of how small you were in comparison. It was 900 meters from bow to stern. Its hull was built from a layered composite that Rosa's team had developed over 7 years of iteration: ceramic metallic outer plates, shock-absorbing metamaterial middle layer, dense reactive inner hull that could partially self-repair minor damage by redistributing material through a network of microchannels. The weapon systems were assessed into the hull, no external protrusions that could be targeted, with the ability to extend and rotate through 360 degrees in every plane. It was, in Rosa's professional opinion, the finest warship ever constructed by any species she had studied. She stopped beside one of her section leads, a tall young man named Dev Chin, who was reviewing the latest structural stress tests on a data pad. "How's she looking?" Rosa asked. "Perfect," Dev said, in the tone of someone who genuinely meant it. "Stress tests on the bow section are coming in at 108% of spec. The new resonance dampeners on the drive core are..." He looked up from the pad and grinned. "They're actually beautiful, Rosa. I've run the simulations 6 times because I didn't believe the numbers." "I believe you," she said. "How many hulls do we have at this stage of completion in Section C?" 42 fully complete, waiting for crew assignment. 16 at final systems integration. He paused. Facility-wide, including all sections and the secondary site at Asteroid 3, 489,842. Almost 500,000. Rosa looked up at the hull being assembled above her. The cranes, the welders, the hundreds of workers moving along the scaffolding like ants building something that dwarfed them completely. She looked at all of this, and she felt the thing she always felt when she stopped to actually look at what they had made. Not pride, exactly. Pride was too simple.
It was more like awe.
The particular awe of someone who has spent years building something so large that even the people building it can't quite hold the whole of it in their heads at once. HFYSciFi, she thought, a phrase she'd picked up from one of her Lahori colleagues years ago, one of those phrases that somehow captured the feeling of something changing permanently, of a before and an after that could never be undone. From now on, nothing would be the same. She hoped they were ready. 3 weeks after that conversation between Lena Cole and Director Harker, something happened that nobody had planned for. The Rethian Combine moved on Sector 9. Not with paperwork, not with another ignored warning, not with the slow bureaucratic pressure that the Conclave had grown accustomed to deflecting. They moved with force. 200 warships of the Combine's 4th Fleet, dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Sector 9 and issuing a declaration of sovereign claim backed by the unspoken argument of their gun ports. The Conclave convened in emergency session. Lena Cole sat in her small chair at the far end of the table and watched 12 species try to figure out how afraid they were. The Velhari were very afraid. Sorvin's composure was perfect, it was always perfect, but his left upper limb dropped every 3 minutes, a tell she had catalogued over 4 years of watching him, and today it was dropping every 3 minutes with the regularity of a clock. The Dasari were less afraid, but deeply calculating. Thresh's silver scales caught the light as he moved, his long fingers tracing patterns on the table surface, a Dasari habit indicating complex modeling, running scenarios. The smaller species, the Torati, the Menaish, the Quell, were frightened in the open, unconcerned way of beings who knew they were not powerful enough to be targets, but close enough to powerful players to be collateral damage. Humanity was technically in Sector 9. The Kepler colony sat on the edge of what the Rethian Combine had just claimed as sovereign territory. Lena waited. The debate ran for 3 hours. The Velhari wanted a formal condemnation. The Dasari wanted economic sanctions. The Rethian's representative Vorg argued, with the calm certainty of someone who had just moved 200 warships into position, that the Combine's actions were entirely lawful under an interpretation of conclave resource law that everyone in the room knew was invented. At the end of 3 hours, Lena raised her hand. The room went quiet, not because they respected her, because it was unusual enough that she spoke at all that it created a moment of automatic attention, the same way you'd look up if a piece of furniture suddenly moved. Ambassador Cole, said the conclave chair, a Velhari named Orvith, ancient and slow and almost entirely ceremonial. You have the floor. Lena stood. She smoothed her jacket. She looked at the room. The Kepler colony, she said, is home to 47,000 human civilians. Under the territorial claim the Rethian Combine has filed today, those 47,000 people would fall under Combine jurisdiction.
She paused.
I would like the Combine's representative to confirm, for the official record, what protections would be guaranteed to those civilians under Combine law. Vorg looked at her. It was the look of someone who has been poked by something they had forgotten was even in the room. Combine law provides standard protections for. Standard protections, Lena said, under Combine Colonial Statute 7, apply to species classified under the Combine's Sapient Recognition Index. Humans are currently listed in the Combine's index as Category 4, a classification that does not trigger full sapient protections. She looked around the table. I would like this to be formally noted. The Rethian Combine is claiming sovereign territory over 47,000 human beings who, under their own law, would not be recognized as fully sapient. The silence that followed was not the silence of people who didn't care. It was the silence of 12 species suddenly doing very rapid political math. Because even if nobody at this table thought humanity was particularly important, the principle she had just laid out, a member species of the conclave having its citizens placed under foreign jurisdiction without full protections, was a principle that could apply to anyone. It was the kind of precedent that every small and medium species in the room was now quietly picturing applied to themselves. It was the kind of speech that didn't change any minds about humanity, but it changed the math. The Conclave issued a formal injunction against the Rethian Combine's territorial claim within the hour. The injunction had teeth: economic sanctions, trade restrictions, a freeze on combined membership privileges, and the 200 warships withdrew from Sector 9 within 48 hours. Lena went back to her cabin on the Resolute and sat at her desk and drank a full cup of terrible instant coffee without tasting it. Marcus knocked on the door and came in with an expression like someone who had just watched someone pull off a magic trick. That was... "Don't," she said. It was masterful. "It bought us time," she said. "It didn't change anything. Vorg will be back in 6 months with a different paperwork argument and a slightly larger fleet, and the Conclave will issue another injunction, and the Combine will test whether the injunction has any more teeth than it did before." She looked at her coffee. "We need 17 more months. Give or take." Because of... Marcus hesitated. He had a vague sense by now that there was something he didn't have clearance to know. "The thing you haven't told me about." "Yes," she said. "Because of that." She looked at the coffee. "Marcus." "Yes. Go to bed. I'll see you at the morning briefing." He went. She stayed. She sat with the photograph face down on her desk and the terrible coffee going cold and the weight of something enormous pressing quietly against the inside of her chest. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the feeling of holding something very heavy for a long time and knowing you can't put it down yet. 17 months, she thought. She could hold it for 17 months. You can't build something this large with fear alone. Fear is a beginning, a spark, an ignition, the first moment of "we cannot let this stand." But fear burns through its fuel quickly, and what's left when the fear quiets down, when the emergency is not yet here but not yet over, when it's just Tuesday and you have another 12-hour shift in a facility buried in an asteroid and nobody outside a very small circle knows what you're doing or why it matters. What keeps you going then is something different. It's the people beside you. Dr. Maya Osei had been the lead weapons systems designer for the UEDI for 11 years. She was 48, tall and methodical, with the particular habit of very precise people who are describing imprecise things, of using her hands to gesture at shapes that didn't exist yet. She had grown up on Earth, in a family where dinner table conversation had always turned, eventually, to the question of humanity's place in the galaxy. Her father had been a Conclave policy analyst. Her mother had been a physicist. From the time she was old enough to understand the reports coming back from Conclave sessions, the careful, diplomatic language that barely covered the contempt underneath, she had felt the particular anger of someone who loves something that is being undervalued. She had become a weapons designer because she understood, in a very direct and practical way, that the only argument that matters to someone who doesn't respect you is one they can't dismiss. The weapons she had built were extraordinary. Not because she had invented new physics, though she had contributed meaningfully to several theoretical advances that had quietly never been published. The weapons were extraordinary because they were designed by someone who had spent 11 years studying every weapon system used by every Conclave member species and asking the same question about all of them. What are the assumptions this was built on? Every weapon system was built on assumptions. The Velhari energy cannons assumed a target that was relatively stationary because the Velhari battle doctrine was built around massive coordinated broadsides, line-of-battle tactics that had dominated Velhari military thinking for centuries. The Dasari precision weapons assumed a target whose shielding systems they understood because Dasari weapons designers worked from an almost philosophical certainty that if you understood something perfectly, you could defeat it perfectly. The Rethian weapons assumed that raw power was sufficient because for most of Rethian military history, it had been. Terran weapons assumed nothing. They were built to be reconfigured mid-fight, to switch between modes, to solve problems that weren't anticipated in the design brief because human weapons designers had a cultural habit, deeply ingrained, going back to the first humans who picked up a rock and asked what else it could be used for, of building tools that were more flexible than they needed to be. Maya had also, in the last 3 years, developed something that she discussed with almost nobody, a theoretical understanding of Velhari shield harmonics that suggested a very specific, very narrow window of vulnerability. She had not told anyone but Director Harker. Not because she was secretive, she wasn't, but because she was a scientist, and the one thing that made her more uncomfortable than a weapon she didn't understand was a weapon whose target she had told too many people about. When the time comes, she had told Harker, I will brief the fleet commanders. Until then, this stays here.
Why?
He had asked. Because, she'd said, the best advantage is the one nobody knows you have. The pilots were something else entirely. Lieutenant Commander Zara Okafor had been flying Terran Defense Force ships since she was 22. She was 37 now, lean and intense, with the particular stillness of high-performance pilots in the moments between flights, the quiet conservation of energy that made them seem almost calm right up until they weren't. She was the lead instructor at the UDI's flight training program, a role that sounded administrative and was, in practice, something closer to shaping the future of the species. She taught 500 pilots a rotation cycle. Each rotation was 6 months. She had been doing this for 8 years, which meant she had personally trained and certified thousands of pilots who were now sitting in the cockpits of ships buried in asteroids at Kepler, waiting for the word. She thought about this sometimes, in the brief, quiet moments between sessions. The weight of that. All those people who had passed through her program and then gone out to sit in those dark berths and train and wait. People who had families on Earth. People who had left normal lives to come out here and do this thing that nobody outside a very small circle knew they were doing. She had a photograph, too. Most people did, out here. Her photograph was of her daughter, Amara, who was 11 years old and lived with Zara's mother in Lagos. Amara thought her mother worked in deep space logistics. Zara thought about this precisely once a day, in the morning before her first session, and then she put it away. Because the thing about what they were building was this. If it worked, nobody would ever know it almost didn't. If it worked, Amara would grow up in a galaxy where humanity's seat at the table was earned and kept and held. If it worked, the photograph would mean something different. Not a choice between being a mother and being a soldier, but proof that the soldier's work was worth it. And if it didn't work. But that was not a thought Zara Okafor entertained. Not because she was afraid of it, but because she had learned, in 20 years of flying ships in conditions that ranged from difficult to genuinely terrifying, that the best way to avoid the bad outcome was to be so prepared for it that it couldn't find a gap in your readiness. She walked into the simulation bay at 0600, the way she did every morning. The room hummed with the sound of 50 flight simulators running simultaneously, the hiss of compressed air systems, the low electronic pulse of readout screens, the muffled sounds of pilots putting their ships through maneuvers in virtual space. She stopped at the first simulator, where a young woman named Cass Moreno was running an evasion drill against a simulated Velhari combat wing. The simulation showed Cass's single ship against 12 Velhari fighters in a close-quarters dogfight. The Velhari AI was set to expert level, the best simulation they had built from captured Velhari tactical data. Cass was winning. Not comfortably. Not cleanly, but winning, dancing her ship through the engagement in the unpredictable, constantly adapting pattern that Zara recognized as genuine instinct, not learned technique. The kind of flying you couldn't teach. The kind that came from some deep, old part of the brain that had been designed, over millions of years of evolution, to navigate complex, three-dimensional, rapidly changing threat environments. In other words, the kind of flying that came from being human. Zara watched until the drill ended. Cass pulled off her headset and looked up, slightly breathless, her dark hair damp at the temples. She was 24, one of the best in this cycle's cohort. How is the Velhari pattern? Zara asked. Predictable, Cass said. Then, catching herself. They're fast and the coordinated fire is intense, but the transition between patterns is always the same. For beats, then the formation shifts. For beats, then the shift. It's like, she searched for the word. Like they can't help it. Like the pattern is in the muscle memory and they can't change it mid-flight. They can't, Zara said. It's doctrinal. Velhari flight doctrine has been unchanged for 200 years because it's never faced anything that could make it change. She looked at the frozen simulation screen. Remember that. When you're out there, and you'll be out there, the moment you see that 4-beat pattern, you already know the next 3 seconds. Cass nodded slowly. And they don't know ours. We don't have one, Zara said. That's the point. She moved on to the next simulator. The people who built the dreadnoughts, designed the weapons, and trained the pilots were not, for the most part, the kind of people who showed up in history books. They were engineers and mechanics and programmers and metallurgists and fuel systems analysts and navigation software designers and hull plating specialists and medical officers and supply chain managers and hundreds of other categories of human being that don't get statues built in their honor. They were people who had been given a problem and had solved it, the way humans solve problems, with creativity and stubbornness, and the particular refusal to accept limits that had carried their species from hunting prey on the African savanna to building 500,000 dreadnoughts in an asteroid field 60 light-years from home. Director Harker knew all of their names. Not because he was required to. Not because there was any protocol that demanded it. But because he believed, with a depth that went beyond policy and management theory, that the people who built something were part of what was built, that a structure was not just its materials but the intention and effort and care of everyone who had touched it. He kept a list, handwritten, on paper, in a journal he had been maintaining since the first day of the project. Every name he could find, every contribution he knew about. He updated it weekly. The journal was 3 volumes long now and growing. He thought, sometimes, about what it would mean for those names to be known. About the day, if the day came, when the list could be made public. When the people on it could say, openly, what they had done and why.
He wanted that for them.
He wanted it more than he wanted almost anything. HFYSciFi, he thought, without knowing exactly where the phrase had come from. It had been in common use among the UDI staff for years, picked up from somewhere and spreading the way phrases do when they capture something that needed to be captured. From now on, things would be different. He wrote another name in the journal. Then he went back to work. 15 months in. 2 months to go. The call came in the middle of the night, station time. Lena Cole was asleep. Actually asleep, which was unusual. She had not been sleeping well for months. When Marcus knocked on her cabin door and kept knocking until she was awake enough to open it.
He was pale.
Not the normal pale of someone woken up suddenly at night. The pale of someone who has just received bad news and has not yet decided what to do with it. The Rethian combine, he said. She was already moving, pulling on her jacket, her mind shifting into the particular gear that it shifted into when things were urgent.
What?
They've moved on Sector 9 again. Not just 200 ships this time. He held out his data pad. They've assembled the combined strike group. All 7 fleets. Lena stopped. She took the data pad. She looked at the numbers. The combined strike group was the full military might of the Rethian combine, not a demonstration, not a show of force, but every warship they could deploy simultaneously, coordinated into a single overwhelming expression of intent. 1,400 ships. The largest military force assembled in conclave space in 300 years. They were positioned at the edge of Sector 9. And the Kepler colony was well inside Sector 9. When, she said, the intelligence reached Conclave High Command 40 minutes ago. The Combine gave formal notification 30 minutes ago. They're calling it a security operation. They've given a 72-hour window for civilian evacuation. Marcus' voice was very careful and very even, the voice of someone being professional under significant pressure. Lena, 47,000 people. I know. And the fleet isn't ready for another 2 months. I know. So what do? Wake up everyone, she said. Full staff call. I want to be at the conclave chamber in 20 minutes. The chamber won't be assembled for hours. Then I'll be early. She was already pulling on her boots. And call Harker. Tell him what's happened. Tell him, she stopped. Thought. Tell him we might need to move the timeline. He said 18 months. 2 months early, she said. Tell him 2 months early. Marcus went. Lena sat on the edge of her bunk for exactly 10 seconds. She allowed herself 10 seconds of this, the particular stillness before the storm, the moment between knowing the bad thing and starting to deal with the bad thing. She thought about 47,000 people who were asleep right now in the Kepler colony, in houses and apartments and research stations and mining outposts, not knowing that 1,400 ships were positioning themselves at the edge of their world. She thought about her parents in Kansas, about the photograph face down on her desk. She thought about what she had been building for 12 years and whether it would be ready, and what it would cost if it wasn't. 10 seconds. Then she stood up. The emergency session convened at 0300 station time, and it was one of the worst 3 hours Lena had ever sat through.
Not because it was chaotic.
It was actually very orderly. Everyone at the table knew what they were supposed to do, and did it. The formal positions, the procedural language, the motions filed and seconded and discussed. The Velhari condemned the Combine. The Dasari called for sanctions. The smaller species expressed concern. The motions were filed. And Vorg, the Rethian representative, sat at his end of the table and watched all of it with the calm, flat patience of someone who had done the math and knew the math worked in his favor. Because the math did work in his favor. The conclave could issue sanctions. It could issue condemnations. It could draft another injunction. But an injunction against 1,400 warships was only as strong as the force willing to enforce it, and every person in that room who had done the math knew that the conclave's combined defensive capacity, excluding the Rethian Combine itself, since you couldn't enforce anything against them with their own ships, was approximately 900 vessels, spread across member territories, with no coordinated command structure, and a history of collective military action that was, diplomatically put, unreliable. The Combine would roll over Kepler in 72 hours. And there was not a thing the conclave could do about it. Except. Lena raised her hand. The room turned. The particular quality of this attention was different than usual. Less polite surprise, more something edged and desperate, because everyone in the room had done the same math and knew they needed an option they didn't currently have. Ambassador Cole, said Chair Orvith. You have the floor. Lena stood. She had been preparing this speech for 12 years. Not writing it. She hadn't written it down, not once, because she had been afraid that writing it would make it real in the wrong way, would give it a fixed shape that might not fit the moment when the moment came. Instead, she had carried it the way you carry something you know you'll need, carefully in the back of your mind, in the part of you that is always planning even when you're doing something else entirely. The conclave, she said, has issued 3 injunctions against the Rethian Combine's expansion into Sector 9. All 3 have been ignored. The Combine has been sanctioned, warned, and formally condemned by this body multiple times, and none of it has changed their behavior because, and I say this with the full weight of 12 years of observation, the Combine does not believe the conclave's enforcement mechanism is real. Vorg's expression didn't change. They are correct, Lena said. Currently. At this moment, the conclave does not have the military capacity to enforce its own injunctions against the combined strike group. The numbers do not work. Sorvin's composure cracked slightly. Not by much, just the faintest stiffening of his upper limbs, the ghost of an expression that meant where is this going. Therefore, Lena said, I am formally placing before the conclave a motion to invoke Article 14 of the Terran Membership Charter. Silence. Marcus, in the gallery, looked at his data pad, frantically. He found the article. Read it. Looked up with an expression she would have found funny under other circumstances. Article 14 of the Terran Membership Charter was a clause that had been inserted into humanity's membership agreement 47 years ago as a formality, a standard provision that appeared in all member charters, rarely invoked, mostly ignored. It read, in the dry technical language of conclave law, in circumstances constituting an existential threat to a member species' sovereign territory, the member species in question may formally request the full defensive support of the conclave body and may additionally commit to the common defense any and all Terran military assets deemed appropriate by the Terran diplomatic mission. Any and all Terran military assets. I am formally requesting conclave support under Article 14, Lena said. And I am formally committing, on behalf of the Terran diplomatic mission and the United Earth Defense Initiative, the full Terran military response. Another silence. Longer this time. Sorvin leaned forward. Ambassador Cole. His voice was very careful. What Terran military response? I have, Lena said, been waiting for you to ask me that. She looked at Harker's channel on her comm, still open from their conversation at 0200. He was ready. She gave him the word. The word went out from Lunar Base 7 at 0320 station time. It traveled at the speed of quantum-encrypted communication across 60 light-years of space, through relay stations buried in asteroid fields and disguised as navigation beacons, through command chains that had been built and tested and rehearsed in silence for years. It was a single word because that was all it needed to be.
Caro.
It was a word that had spread through the UEDI the same way the phrase of SYMJHY had organically passed from person to person until it was just part of the culture, meaning something that couldn't quite be expressed in standard English. A combination of now and rise and we are ready, and the sound of something that has been held still for a very long time finally being released.
Caro.
In the births of Kepler Deep Space Resource Processing and Logistics Hub, which everyone who worked there now called openly the Kepler shipyards, 489,842 ships woke up. Not all at once. There was a sequence, a choreography that Rosa Delgado had designed and rehearsed 40 times over the past 3 years. Every rehearsal flawlessly executed, every timing refined until she could close her eyes and hear the sequence in her head like music. The power-up sequence began in Section A, the oldest part of the facility, where the first ships had been completed. 2,000 drives igniting in sequence, their emissions masked by the asteroid's mass until they were fully operational, then rising in controlled columns through launch corridors that had been cut through the rock over years of quiet excavation. Then Section B. Then Section C. Then the secondary facility at Asteroid 3, and the tertiary facility at Asteroid 7, and the distributed berths spread across 30 other smaller rocks in the system. All of it waking up in the order Rosa had planned, wave after wave after wave. Rosa stood in the main control center and watched the boards light up.
She had a headset on.
The chatter of 2,000 simultaneous launch sequences filled her ears. Call signs, status reports, confirming checklist items, the professional shorthand of people who were very well trained doing very difficult things calmly. Around her, 60 staff watched 60 boards, tracking every section of the deployment. Dev Chun was at the station beside her. He glanced at her once, and his expression was— there wasn't a word for what his expression was. She had never seen it on a person before. She thought maybe it was the expression of someone who has built something for so long that they stopped quite believing it was real, and now it is real, and the brain is trying to catch up to the fact of it. "How are we looking?" she asked, even though she could see the boards.
"Perfect," he said.
She watched the numbers climb. Lieutenant Commander Zara Okafor's ship was designated TDS Vigilant, a Class 1 dreadnought, the largest classification in the Terran fleet, 912 meters from bow to stern, crewed by 48 people, armed with 12 primary weapon systems and 47 secondary systems, powered by a fusion drive array that Rose's team had pushed to 115% of original spec. Zara had been assigned command of Vigilant 3 years ago, when it rolled off the production line in Section A. She had spent 3 years learning every meter of it, running her crew through every drill, studying every system until she understood not just what it did but why it did it and what it would do when it did it wrong. She knew her ship the way she knew her own hands. At 0321 station time, she brought the Vigilant online. The bridge hummed to life around her, screens, readouts, the steady pulse of systems confirming themselves healthy and ready. Her crew moved through their stations with the brisk efficiency of people who have prepared for this exact moment for years. At the navigation station, Lieutenant Park J1, 31, formerly a freight pilot, best three-dimensional spatial awareness of anyone Zara had trained. At weapons, Lieutenant Soo Kim, 34, steady and precise, with a quality of focused calm under pressure that Zara had spent years trying to cultivate in others and had simply found, already fully formed, in Soo. At engineering, Chief Petty Officer Dom Santos, 42, who had been Rosa Delgado's student 11 years ago and who could diagnose a drive problem by sound alone. At communications, Ensign Priya Mehta, 26, who had the rare gift of maintaining clarity under intense communication load. And at the command chair, Zara herself. "All stations," she said. "Status." The confirmations came in, one after another, clean and fast. Navigation ready. Weapons ready. Engineering ready. Communications ready. Medical ready. She looked at her forward screen, where the launch corridor stretched ahead of them, a long rectangular tunnel cut through rock, leading up and out into space. "Vigilant, this is Fleet Control," said a voice in her headset. "You are cleared for departure." Wing 7 is forming up at Rally Point Delta.
Vigilant copies, Zara said.
We are go for departure. She looked at her crew. They looked back at her. She thought of Amara. She put it away.
Take us out, she said.
The first ships emerged from the asteroids like something impossible. Like a dream that doesn't follow the rules of the world you built it in. They came out in columns, then in wings, then in formations so large that they reshaped the light around the asteroids as they gathered, thousands of dreadnoughts, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, assembling into the largest military formation in recorded history in a system that the Conclave's charts listed as a logistics hub. UEDI Fleet Command had planned the assembly with the same obsessive precision that characterized every other aspect of the project. The formations had been designed not just for tactical effectiveness, but for the communication they would send, the specific, unavoidable, visceral communication of 500,000 warships arranged in perfect order.
Not scattered.
Not disorganized. Not the scrambled response of a species caught off guard and throwing everything it had. Ordered. Deliberate. Patient. We have been ready for a long time, the formation said, without a word. You just didn't know to look. At the edge of the Kepler system. Far enough out to be in clear space but close enough to make the geometry undeniable. The fleet assembled. It took 4 hours and 17 minutes. At the end of those 4 hours and 17 minutes, the sensor arrays of a Rethian Combine scout ship positioned at the edge of Sector 9, put there to watch the Kepler colony in preparation for the strike group's arrival, registered something that caused the scout ship's sensor officer to check their readings 3 times before filing a report, because the readings didn't make sense. The readings said that the Kepler system, which was supposed to contain a logistics hub and 47,000 civilians and no meaningful military capability, now contained 500,000, 112 warships. The scout ship's captain read the report. Then she read it again. Then she sent it to Combined Strike Group Command with the highest priority flag in the Combine's communication system. And in the flagship of the Combined Strike Group, a Rethian warship so massive it had its own gravity well. Admiral Garoth read the report and set it down and looked out the viewport at the stars. That can't be right, he said. Admiral, said his sensor chief, we've cross-referenced with 3 independent arrays. The readings are... I heard you, Garoth said. He was quiet for a long time. 500,000 ships. The Rethian Combine's combined strike group was 1,400 vessels. The largest military force in active deployment in the galaxy. The force that had never once, in Rethian military history, met anything larger than itself. He looked out at the stars. Get me the conclave, he said. Lena Cole was still standing at the conclave table when the message from the Rethian Combined Strike Group came in. She had not sat down. She hadn't planned that, it wasn't performance. She was just still standing because she had been standing when she made the motion, and there had seemed to be no natural moment to sit down, and she had been watching the room for the past 4 hours with the attention of someone who has waited a very long time for something to happen and doesn't want to miss a second of it. The message from Admiral Garoth arrived at 0741 station time. The conclave chamber's main display, an enormous curved screen at the far end of the room that was usually used for maps and treaty text, filled with the image of a Rethian admiral, gray-furred and massive, with an expression that was very carefully controlled. Conclave, Garoth said. I am requesting clarification of the military assets currently assembled in the Kepler system. A pause. Under the Terran flag. The chamber went completely silent. Every ambassador at the table was still. Even the Velhari aides in the gallery above had stopped their quiet movements. The entire room had the specific quality of people whose mental models of the world have just been very severely challenged. Sorvin was looking at Lena. He had been looking at her since she made the motion, not with the polite, dismissive inattention she was used to from him, but with the intent, focused look of someone trying to figure out how much they had missed and when they missed it. Lena looked back at him. Then she looked at the screen. Admiral Garoth, she said, and her voice was calm, not artificially calm, not performed calm, but the genuine calm of someone who has played out this moment in their heads so many times that the reality of it feels familiar. What you are seeing is the Terran Defense Force, 1st through 8th Combined Fleets, operating under Article 14 of the Terran Membership Charter, which the Conclave ratified 47 years ago. She paused. To be precise, you are looking at 500,112 Terran Dreadnoughts. Garoth's jaw moved slightly. He wasn't speaking. He was processing. The Terran Defense Force, Lena continued, is formally requesting that the Rethian Combined Strike Group withdraw from Sector 9 within the next 24 hours, in compliance with the Conclave's standing injunction. She looked at him directly. I understand this is an unexpected development. I wanted to give you the full picture before the formal request, so that the decision you make is fully informed. Another silence. Longer. Then Garoth said, very quietly, Your 47 warships. I beg your pardon? Lena said. The Conclave's intelligence assessment, Garoth said. For the Terran system. 47 warships. His voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it, not fear, exactly, because Rethian admirals did not become admirals by feeling fear in tactical situations. More like the recognition of an error so large it had structural implications. That was the assessment. That was our home system's registered defense capacity, Lena said. The Conclave's open records. We didn't falsify anything. She paused. We simply built the rest somewhere that wasn't included in the assessment. Garoth looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the stars. I will contact Combined Strike Group Command, he said. The feed cut. The conclave chamber erupted. Not loudly, these were ambassadors, trained for exactly the kind of professional control that prevented loud eruptions. But the room filled with rapid side conversations, urgent whispered exchanges, aides being summoned and dismissed, and the underlying vibration of a collective power structure being rapidly recalculated. Sorvin reached Lena's end of the table first. He moved quickly for a 3-meter exoskeletal being, and he was at her elbow before she had fully sat down, his translator bead pulsing as he spoke in low, rapid Velhari, not old high Velhari. She noticed the diplomatic ceremonial language. Just Velhari. The language people used when they forgot to perform. Ambassador Cole. The intelligence assessment on Terran military capacity was accurate, she said. For home system. The shipyards in the Kepler system are registered as logistics infrastructure in the Conclave's commercial registry. She met his gaze, which we filed correctly 47 years ago. Sorvin was quiet for a moment. His left upper limb dropped, way down, the lowest she had ever seen it. When, he said, and there was something genuine in his voice that she had never heard from him before. Not anger, not calculation, something rawer than that. When did you start building? She thought about it. About Harker at his desk with the first sketches. About Rosa Delgado in an asteroid field 9 years ago, saying we'll need a bigger one. About Zara Okafor in the flight simulation bay at 0600 and Maya Ose drawing weapon specifications on digital whiteboards, and Marcus Face when he first understood what he'd been assigned to. About her parents in Kansas who had believed, without complicated reasoning, that their children could matter. A while, she said. Sorvin held her gaze for a long time. Then he said, You are not what we thought you were. No, she said. We're not. Thresh, the Das-Sari ambassador, came next. Then the representatives of the Torati, the Menaish, the Quell, and 5 other species who had, for 4.5 decades, barely acknowledged humanity's presence at this table. They did not all come at once. They came one by one, or in pairs, in the careful way that powerful people approach someone whose power they have just been forced to recognize, with the particular combination of respect and recalibration that is honest without being gracious. She heard different things from each of them. The Torati ambassador, a small shimmering being named Alf, told her that his people had always expected great things from humanity. Lena smiled and did not say what she thought. Thresh was more direct. He said, We will want to renegotiate the trade framework. She said, We'll schedule it. The Quell representative, speaking through a complex translator array, because the Quell communicated primarily in electromagnetic pulses, told her that humanity's approach to this situation was historically unprecedented in its strategic patience. She said, Thank you, and thought about all the people buried in asteroids for years who deserved that observation more than she did. Chair Orvith summoned her to his private office, a large, austere room that smelled of the particular chemical that Velhari secreted when they were in a position of institutional authority. He was old, Orvith. Older than any human would ever be. He had been chair of the conclave for 60 years and had seen things that would take another lifetime to explain. He looked at her for a long time before he spoke. The conclave, he said finally, has made assumptions about your people.
Yes, she said.
Those assumptions were incorrect. Yes. And you have been aware of this for
12 years, she said.
More or less. He was quiet. You could have corrected us, he said. Would you have listened? He considered this carefully. He was a being who had spent 60 years at the highest level of galactic governance. He considered things carefully because he had seen what happened when you didn't. No, he said finally. We would not. Then I chose not to correct you, she said. I chose to build something that couldn't be ignored.
You have done that, he said.
He looked at the floor, then back at her. There will be renegotiations. Of the charter, the trade agreements, the security framework. I know. Humanity's representation at this table will be equal, she said. Not symbolic. Not courteous. Equal. He looked at her. Then he said, in a slight, formal inclination of the head that was the Velhari gesture of genuine respect, a gesture she had seen him use exactly twice in 12 years of observation, both times with species that had earned it. Yes. She went back to her seat at the far end of the table. She sat in the small chair, the low one, built for human proportions. She thought, that chair's going to change. News travels fast in a galaxy connected by quantum communication. Faster, in some ways, than people are ready for it. The story broke on Conclave Public Networks at 0900 station time, less than 2 hours after the meeting with Admiral Garoth. Terran Defense Force deploys 500,000 DREADNOU GHD fleet in response to Rethian aggression. The headline was followed by a sensor feed, live, uncut, the actual sensor data from the Kepler system translated into a visual that any sapient being in the conclave could understand. 500,000 ships. In formation. Under one flag. The response across conclave space was, to use a word that transcended species, seismic. On Earth, it was 1,300 hours in Kansas when David and Ruth Cole saw the news. Ruth was in the kitchen preparing lunch when David called her from the living room with a particular tone of voice that meant he was looking at something he needed her to see. She came in wiping her hands and looked at the wall display. She looked at it for a long time. Then she sat down. That's Lena, David said. His voice was doing something complicated, not proud, exactly, though there was pride in it. Something bigger and less comfortable than simple pride. The feeling of something you believed in without knowing exactly what you believed in suddenly becoming concrete. That's our Lena. The display was showing Ambassador Lena Cole at the conclave table, speaking to the full assembly. The camera angle was from the gallery, small and neat and steady in her blue jacket, at the far end of the long table. She looks tired, Ruth said. She looks, David stopped. She looks like she's been carrying something for a long time. Ruth reached over and took his hand. They watched. On Lunar Base 7, Director Harker was in his office when the news broke. He was already watching the sensor feeds from Kepler, had been watching them since 0321, since Caro went out because he had not been able to leave his desk, could not have left if he'd wanted to. He watched the feed and watched the numbers and watched the formations assembling in space 60 light-years away, and he felt the specific emotion that you feel when something you have spent the best years of your life building turns out to be real. He opened his journal. The 3rd volume. He found the last page he'd written on, and he picked up his pen, and he wrote one line. It worked. Then he closed the journal, and he cried, quietly, at his desk, the way people cry when they're alone, and the thing they've been holding is finally set down. Not grief. Not quite joy. The feeling of weight leaving. He dried his face. He had a very full day ahead. In the Kepler system, aboard the TDS Vigilant, Zara Okafor was on the bridge when the sensor report came in from the Conclave's public network. The Rethian Combined Strike Group had begun withdrawing from Sector 9. All 1,400 ships, turning around, moving back toward combined space. No battle. No engagement. No shot fired.
Just gone.
Her crew watched the withdrawal in silence for a moment. Then Dom Santos at the engineering station said, "Well." And Sue Kim at weapons said, "Yeah." And Park Jae-won at navigation said something in Korean that the translator rendered as approximately, "This is the best Tuesday I have ever had," which landed well enough that several people laughed. Zara looked at her forward screen, at the stars that the Rethyan fleet was withdrawing through, and she thought of Amara in Lagos, 11 years old, who thought her mother worked in deep space logistics. She would need to have a conversation with Amara. Not yet. But soon. Soon there would be no need to hide this anymore. The thought settled in her chest like light. On Kepler Colony, 47,000 civilians who had gone to sleep 24 hours ago not knowing that 1,400 enemy ships were positioning to enter their system woke up to find the news on every channel, in every format, in every translation. The evacuation order that had been issued at 0100, quietly, through the colonial emergency system, to prevent panic, was rescinded at 0922. People came out of their houses and their outposts and their research stations, and they looked at the sky. The sky looked the same as it always had. But they knew the way you know something after it's been explained and can never be unknown, that somewhere behind that ordinary-looking sky, spread across space in perfect formation, were 500,000 ships with their names on them. Their planet's flag. Their species. A colony administrator named Tom Harrigan, 52 years old, who had spent 20 years building irrigation infrastructure in Kepler's northern continent, stood outside his office and looked at the morning sky for a long time. Then he went inside and called his daughter on Earth. "Did you see the news?" he said when she picked up. "Dad," she said, "everyone on Earth has seen the news. People are..." He could hear noise behind her, voices, the particular sound of many people reacting to something enormous. "Dad, they're calling it the awakening. Someone put it on social media and it spread everywhere. The human awakening. That's what they're calling it." Tom Harrigan looked out the window of his office at the ordinary sky. "The awakening," he said. "Are you okay?" his daughter asked. "You're on Kepler, right? Were you scared?" He thought about it. The honest answer was yes, deeply, in the specific way you're scared when something very large is coming toward the people you care about and you can't do anything about it. But the other honest answer was, not for long. "I'm good," he said. "I'm really, really good." Admiral Garoth did not sleep for 36 hours after filing his withdrawal order. He did not sleep because he was doing what all good military commanders do after a significant event. He was reviewing everything he had known, everything he had assumed, and everything he had built on top of those assumptions, looking for where the fault line ran. He was a thorough person. He had not become admiral of the Rethyan Combined Strike Group by being anything other than thorough. He was also, by the standards of his species, unusually honest with himself, a quality that was not always considered an asset in Rethyan military culture, which had a complicated relationship with the idea that you might be wrong. He was wrong. Comprehensively, structurally, from the foundations upward. Wrong. He sat in his command suite on the flagship and pulled up every intelligence report about Terran military capacity from the past 20 years. He read them all. Every one. The same language, the same data, the same confident summaries, 47 warships, minimal defensive capability, negligible threat, no strategic significance. He read them, and he thought about the 500,000 ships in the Kepler system, and he understood, with the particular clarity that comes after a significant shock, exactly how this had happened. They had not been wrong about the data. They had been wrong about what to do with it. They had received data, a species with limited visible military infrastructure, a small number of registered warships, a diplomatic presence that was consistent but not assertive, and they had processed that data through a filter that said, small means weak. Limited means limited. Quiet means nothing there. They had put the data into the machine of their assumptions, and the machine had given them an answer that was tidy and comfortable and completely disconnected from reality. Because the reality he could now see very clearly in retrograde, was this. A species that evolved in a dangerous environment and reached space was not small because it was weak. It was small because it was new. And new things grow. He thought about the 47-year arc, First contact, conclave membership, 47 years of sitting at the far end of the table in a small chair, never making waves, never asserting itself. 47 years of being exactly as invisible as the other species needed them to be. While they built, he thought about the patience that required, the discipline, the strategic intelligence, not just the intelligence to make the plan, but the intelligence to stick to it for 4 decades, through every slight and dismissal and diplomatic insult, and never flinch. He had been in military service for 40 years. He had served under 4 supreme commanders and fought in 3 major conflicts. He had studied strategy at the finest military institution in the Combine. He had never encountered strategic patience of that order. And he had underestimated it because it had come from a species that everyone had agreed, without particularly examining the agreement, was not significant. He filed his full incident report at 0800 on the second day. It was honest. It was thorough. It was the kind of report that could end a career, and he wrote it anyway because the alternative, filing a report that softened the reality, would have made him into the kind of admiral who didn't deserve the position. The Terran Defense Force, he wrote, represents a strategic asset of the First Order. The fundamental assumption underlying all previous Combine assessments of Terran military capacity was the belief that what we could see was all that existed. That assumption was incorrect. The Terrans built in concealment, within the letter of conclave law, over a period of approximately 2 decades, a fleet that exceeds the combined military capacity of all other conclave member species. This was accomplished through the deliberate exploitation of our assumption that they were not worth watching carefully. He paused. Then he added one more line. I recommend that all future assessments of Terran intentions and capabilities be treated as first priority intelligence, with the recognition that the Terrans have demonstrated the capacity and the willingness to operate on timelines that exceed our standard strategic planning horizons by an order of magnitude. He submitted the report. Then he looked out at the stars of combined space and he thought, there's going to be a renegotiation of everything. He was not sure, for the first time in a very long time, what the Combine's position was going to be in that renegotiation. But he thought, and this was a thought he would not have been capable of 48 hours ago, that it was going to be different than they expected. Much different. The Rethian Conclave ambassador, Vorg, sent a private message to Lena Cole at 1100 on the second day. It was brief. It was not an apology. Rethian culture did not have a direct equivalent for apology in the sense that humans used it. The closest they had was a formal acknowledgement of recalibration, which carried none of the emotional weight of the human concept. The message read, Ambassador Cole, the Combine requests a formal bilateral meeting at your earliest convenience. The previous assessment of Sector 9 status is under review. Lena read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Marcus with a note that said, schedule it. Give them the later slot, they'll wait. She thought about Vorg's expression in the conclave chamber all those months. The flat, patient, absolute confidence that the Combine could do what it wanted in Sector 9 because nobody with the ability to stop them would bother. She thought about sitting in the small chair at the far end of the table while that confidence filled the room like a second atmosphere, something everyone breathed without noticing. She thought, HFYSciFi. From now on, they would bother. History is made in big moments, the deployments, the speeches, the confrontations across conclave tables, but it is changed in the small ones. In the morning briefings where the agenda is different than it was 6 months ago. In the hallway conversations that now include a voice that wasn't included before. In the seat that is replaced and the new one that arrives, and the way the people around the table rearrange themselves. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small continuous adjustments of beings recalibrating their understanding of who matters. 6 weeks after the Kepler standoff, the conclave convened to amend the membership charter. It was the first time the charter had been amended in 80 years, and it was the first time in the conclave's 3,000-year history that a charter amendment had been initiated by a member species that had not previously been considered a major power. The amendment was comprehensive. It restructured the voting framework to give equal weight to each member species on matters of collective security. Previously, the 5 founding species, Belhari, Dasari, Rethian, and 2 others, had held weighted votes. It reformed the intelligence sharing protocols to require disclosure of military capabilities above a defined threshold, a clause that everybody understood was written specifically to prevent another species from doing what humanity had done, and which Lena had insisted on herself, because she believed that the best use of the advantage they'd built was to help rebuild the trust that the old system had eroded. And it formally retired the category classification system under which human beings had been classified as less than fully sapient in Rethian law. That last clause was not politically controversial. It passed unanimously. Lena's chair at the conclave table was replaced before the first amended charter session. Not with a larger chair. She hadn't asked for that. She'd asked that her chair be placed at the table's center. Not at the head. She hadn't asked for that either, and she wouldn't have, because this wasn't about dominance. It was about something simpler and more durable, belonging. She sat in the new chair, at the center of the table between the Dasari and Torati ambassadors, and she listened to the room the way she had always listened, carefully, with the attention of someone who understood that information was the most valuable resource in any room. But this time, when she raised her hand, people listened before they knew they should. Marcus Webb came to her office 2 months after the standoff with a report and an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who has learned something that reorganized what they thought they knew. "I went back," he said, "to the founding records, the conclave's original charter. And the seat placement," he said, "the small chair at the end. I assumed it was institutional habit, that they'd always place new members at the end until they'd been there long enough to." He stopped. It wasn't habit. It was deliberate. The founding members wrote the seating protocol specifically to place new or lower status members at the periphery. It was designed to communicate status from the moment you sat down. "I know," Lena said. "You knew." "I knew by the end of my second year," she said, "when I found the original architectural specifications for the chamber in the conclave archive." She looked at him. "It's one of the reasons I understood very early that the only way to change our position here was not to argue for recognition, but to build something that made the argument irrelevant." Marcus sat with that for a moment. "Weren't you angry?" he said. She thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about everything. "Yes," she said, "constantly, in a quiet, very focused way that I used as fuel." She paused. "Anger is underrated as a propellant. It burns long and steady if you don't let it turn into bitterness." "The difference being?" "Bitterness," she said, "is anger that's given up believing the thing can change." "I never gave up." Marcus nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know," he said, with a careful earnestness that was his most characteristic quality, the thing about him that Lena had come to value most deeply over the months of working together, that I think what you did, what all of you did, Harker and Delgado, and everyone at Kepler, I think it's the most significant thing that's happened to humanity in our conclave membership. Maybe in a long time. "We were a team," she said. "Don't forget that. You were the face of it." "I was one part of it," she said. "The part that sits in a room and talks. The part that matters less than people think and more than people see." She smiled slightly. "The engineers built the ships. The pilots would have flown them. The scientists designed the weapons. I just asked the right question at the right moment." "The right question?" Marcus asked. She looked at him. "What can't be ignored?" Zara Okafor brought TDS Vigilant into Station Veritha's new military docking bay, the one that had been hastily designated after the Conclave's emergency sessions, because nobody had planned for the need to accommodate Terran Dreadnoughts at the station, 3 months after the standoff. The docking approach required a significant expansion of the standard navigation corridor. Vigilant was, by some margin, the largest ship that had ever attempted to dock at Verith. The station's original designers had not imagined this would ever be necessary. Zara navigated it with the particular attention of a pilot who takes challenging docking situations seriously, with Park's navigation data laid against her own instincts, and she felt the thump of magnetic clamps engaging with a specific satisfaction. "Well done," she said to the bridge crew. "Velhari Docking Authority is saying our clearance took 17 minutes of negotiation," Park reported, with what she recognized as restrained amusement. "They had to redesign 3 approach vectors on the fly." "Tell them we appreciate the accommodation," Zara said. She left the bridge in Sue's hands and walked through the ship to the main airlock. In the junction corridor outside the lock, she paused. She pulled out her comm and opened her messages to Amara. She had called Amara the morning after the withdrawal, as she'd thought she would. It had been a longer conversation than she expected, not because Amara was surprised exactly, but because 11-year-olds have a very practical approach to significant information. They want to know all the facts, and then they want to know what happens next, and then they want to know when you're coming home. When are you coming home was the question Zara had been most afraid of. The answer, not yet, there's a lot of work, but soon, had been accepted with the particular equanimity of a child who has been raised by a grandmother who believes that competent people should be trusted to handle things, and who has always quietly believed her mother was among the most competent people on any planet. Zara typed a message. Docked at Station Verith. Working. Thinking of you. Then she went through the airlock and into the station. The crew of the Vigilant were given 48 hours of shore leave at Verith. Most of them spent it the way human beings spend sudden, unexpected free time after sustained high-pressure work. They wandered. They ate things they hadn't eaten in months. They found bars that served the specific combination of familiar and new that made them feel like they were discovering something. They found viewing platforms and looked out at the stars. Dom Santos found a mechanical workshop in the civilian district, a Torrity engineering firm that worked on environmental systems for the station, and spent 6 hours helping them with a heat exchanger problem that had been giving them trouble for weeks, simply because he happened to be walking past when the shop manager was staring at the unit with the expression of someone who was running out of ideas, and Dom found the expression familiar and went in to help. The shop manager, a Torrity named Vel, was initially baffled by the offer and then, as Dom got to work, increasingly impressed, and by the end of the 6 hours they had solved the problem, and Vel had taught Dom 3 Torrity maintenance techniques that Dom spent the rest of the shore leave thinking about. Sue Kim visited the Conclave's Public Cultural Archive and spent most of a day in the Dasari history section, reading about the Dasari's early spacefaring age. She told Priya later that she'd expected to find it triumphalist. Species histories usually were the version of the story where your people are the heroes, but it was stranger and more interesting than that. They write about all the mistakes, she said. In detail. There's a whole section called The Generations We Got Wrong. I kept reading it thinking, this is so honest, I don't quite know how to respond to it. Priya had spent her shore leave in the communications district, which was where the various species information networks intersected, and she had been tracking the coverage of the standoff and its aftermath across Conclave media. She reported back to Zara, formally, in the way she reported everything, systematically and without editorial embellishment. The Velhari Press is calling it a strategic realignment, she said. The Dasari networks are mostly focused on the Charter Amendment and what it means for trade framework renegotiation. The Rethian state media is not covering it directly. They're running general programming about combined resource policy.
She paused.
Non-conclave independent networks, there are about 40 I can access, are calling it the human awakening. That term is everywhere. Also Caro. It's turned up in about 60% of independent coverage untranslated. They're using the human word. Zara absorbed this. And the human networks? Priya's expression changed slightly. Celebratory. Intensely so. There's a lot of, the word vindication comes up a lot. Also words like finally and we knew, and she paused. There are a lot of people posting about family members they didn't know were at Kepler, whose names they're just finding out. People who were part of this that their families.
She stopped. Zara thought about Amara.
Yes, she said. That's going to be a significant conversation for a lot of people. Are you all right? Priya asked. I'm working on it, Zara said. The hardest part was not the years. The hardest part was not the patience, the hiding, the long arc of building something that couldn't yet be named. Those things were difficult in ways that rewarded stubbornness, and humans, on the whole, were very good at stubborn. The hardest part was the people you didn't tell. Rosa Delgado flew back to Earth 3 months after the standoff and went to see her parents in a small house in what used to be called Southern California, now part of the Pacific coastal region. Her father was 81, her mother 78. They had been told for 9 years that their daughter was running logistics in deep space, which was true, technically, in the same way that a mountain is technically a geological formation. She landed at the regional port and rented a car and drove the road she had driven hundreds of times to reach the small house with the red door and the old fig tree in the front yard, and she sat in the car for about 5 minutes before she went in. Her father was in the garden. He had always been in the garden when she arrived. He said the garden told him when she was coming, which she had always assumed was the kind of thing fathers said, but which she was no longer entirely confident was wrong. He looked up when she came through the gate, and his face did something complicated and immediate. "There she is," he said. She hugged him. She was not a particularly demonstrative person, the engineering background, the management position, the years of being the one in the room who was calm when everyone else wasn't. She hugged her father in the garden anyway, and held on for longer than she usually did, and he let her, and he patted her back in the way that hadn't changed in 40 years. "I saw the news," he said. "Yeah. That was you. Some of it." He held her at arm's length and looked at her. He was a small man, dark-eyed, with hands that looked like hers, the same shape, the same capability, the same evidence of years of work. "How long?" 9 years, she said. He was quiet. "Did it work?" he asked. "It worked," she said. He nodded. Not surprised, not performing surprise, not performing anything. Just absorbing it, the way a person absorbs a fact that changes the shape of things they thought they knew. "Good," he said. They went inside. Her mother made food. There was a lot of food. Her mother always made a lot of food, on the principle that the presence of food was both comfort and celebration, and she preferred to be prepared for both. They sat at the table in the small kitchen that smelled exactly the way it had always smelled, and they ate, and Rosa told them everything. Not everything she could tell publicly, not the classified pieces, though most of it was being declassified now in stages. The personal everything. The first day she understood what she was really building. The first hull that rolled off the line and made the numbers real. The rehearsals. The years of grinding repetitive work that was unglamorous but necessary. The people she had worked beside. The day Kara went out. Her mother cried a little, quietly, while listening. Not from sadness. Rosa didn't think it was sadness. More like the emotion of having held something, worry, distance, 9 years of not quite understanding where her daughter was or what she was doing, and feeling it release all at once. Her father listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Caro." "Yeah," she said. "SYMJHY," he said, in a voice that made her think he understood the phrase better than the people who had coined it. "Yeah," she said again. Director Harker flew to Kansas. Not officially, not as director of the UEDI, which was now a publicly known organization with a public mission statement and a staff photo on a government website. He went personally, in a civilian shuttle, because Lena Cole's parents were not the kind of people you visited officially. They were the kind of people you visited because you owed them something that couldn't be expressed in a memo. He knocked on the door of the house in Kansas, and Ruth Cole opened it and looked at him. "Director Harker," she said. "Mrs. Cole," he said. "I came to tell you your daughter is one of the finest people I have ever known. And I wanted you to hear that from me, directly, because—" He stopped. He had planned this more carefully in his head. Because she spent 12 years being invisible on purpose, so that something important could happen. And the people who do that don't always get to hear what they built. Ruth Cole looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come in." David Cole was at the table with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had been thinking about something long enough to be calm about it. He stood up when Harker came in, and they shook hands, and they sat down, and Ruth made coffee, and they talked for 2 hours. They talked about Lena as a child, not the ambassador, not the diplomat, but the girl who had been fierce and quiet and determined in the way of people who have decided something fundamental without being able to explain it yet. They talked about what it had been like for them. These 12 years of proud distance, of seeing news fragments from the conclave that didn't quite capture what their daughter was doing there, of not knowing how much she was doing. At one point, David Cole said, "She called us. After. The day after the standoff." "What did she say?" Harker asked. "She said, 'Dad, I built something.' And I said, 'I saw.'" He looked down at his coffee cup. "And she said, 'It worked, Dad. It actually worked.' And then she didn't cry. Lena doesn't cry on calls. She's always been like that, but she sounded like she almost did." He paused. "I think she'd been holding that for a long time." Harker thought about the journal. 3 volumes of names. He thought about the day Kara went out. She had, he said. She really had. 1 year later, the Conclave's new security framework had been in operation for 11 months. The charter amendments had been ratified, the trade agreements renegotiated, the seating arrangements changed. The Rethine Combine had withdrawn from the Sector 9 territorial claim completely and filed a formal acknowledgement, the Rethine equivalent of a significant diplomatic gesture, of the Kepler colony's sovereign status. The UEDI had been formally disclosed to the Conclave and its fleet information shared as required under the new transparency protocols. The Dreadnoughts remained in deployment because the fleet was real and the commitment was real, and the Conclave's security calculus had been fundamentally rebuilt around the fact of them. But they were not at battle stations. They were not positioned for conflict. They were doing the slow, ordinary, important work of a military presence in a stable structure: patrols, logistics, joint exercises with Dasari defense forces, the gradual integration of humans into Conclave security operations that turned the fleet from a shock to a fact. Lena Cole was still at Station Vareth. She had been offered a state return to Earth, a formal procession, ceremonies, the kind of recognition that governments give to people who have done things that cannot be adequately expressed in less elaborate form. She had deferred it, not declined. She would go, eventually, when the work here was stable enough to leave for a few weeks. But there was still work. There was always still work. She was sitting in her new office, a real office, not a cabin on a diplomatic vessel, with a desk and a window that looked out on the station and the docking lanes, when Marcus knocked and came in. He was different these days. Not entirely. The earnestness was still there, the intensity, the quality of someone who is always thinking about things just a beat faster than he's talking about them. But had been tempered by the year, by what he'd been through, by the understanding of complexity that comes from being in the room when complex things actually happen. He had, Lena thought, become very good. The Velhari ambassador's office confirmed the bilateral meeting for Thursday, he said. The Tordi representative wants to add the Environmental Compact review to the agenda. I said we discuss it as a separate item. Fine. The Dasari Trade Commission sent a revised proposal. It's better than the last one, but there are still 3 clauses that. Send me the analysis. Already in your queue. He paused. Also, and this came in this morning, the Quell representative is requesting observer status on the joint defense exercises. Lena looked up. The Quell were a small species. Their home system was in the Outer Territories, one of the minor systems that the old Conclave framework had never quite acknowledged as significant. They had been at the table for 100 years and had never been asked to contribute to security operations. Grant it, she said. Without consultation? Who would I need to consult? Marcus thought about it. No one, he said, with a slight recognition in his voice. Because we can just do that now. Because we can just do that now, she agreed. Lena went to the viewport window in her office. The station spread around and below her. Vareth, 3,000 years of civilization layered on itself, the meeting place of 12 species who had been working out how to coexist for longer than humanity had been writing down its history. Ships moved through the docking lanes in every direction. Velhari vessels, pale and elegant. Dasari ships, silver and bright. Rethine freighters, massive and deliberate. And there, in the new military sector that hadn't existed a year ago, TDS Vigilant and 4 other Terran Dreadnoughts, enormous and steady, the flag of Earth displayed in the running lights. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about 47 years. About the paperwork problem that had brought humanity here. About the small chair at the far end of a very long table and the careful, deliberate invisibility of a species that had decided, without making any announcements, that one day things would be different. She thought about Rosa Delgado in an asteroid field, about Maya Ose drawing weapons specifications, about Zara Okafor at 0600 in the flight sim bay, teaching pilots to fly in 3 dimensions, because that's what humans did. About Harker's handwritten journal, 3 volumes, all the names. About her parents in Kansas, watching the news. About the word Caro, and how it had spread through the project the way all the best things spread. Not through official channels, not because someone decided it should, but because it captured something true that needed a sound.
She thought,
We did this.
not I.
Not a single person, not a single decision, not a single moment.
We.
The accumulated weight of 23 years of human stubbornness and fear and love and engineering and patience, and the refusal, the absolute, non-negotiable, fundamentally human refusal, to accept that being small meant being nothing. She opened her comm. She called her parents. Her father answered on the second ring, the way he always did. "There's my girl," he said. "Hi, Dad. How's the galaxy?" She looked at the Terran Dreadnoughts in the docking bay, enormous and still, running lights bright in the dark. "Changed," she said. "For the better?" She thought about everything. The whole of it. The long arc of it, and where it had landed, and what came next, because there was always a what came next, always more work, always another meeting on Thursday, and another treaty clause that needed attention, and another species asking for observer status on something that used to be closed to them. But also, the seat at the center of the table. The ships under the Earth flag. The Caro that had gone out at 0321 and reached 60 light-years of hidden fleet and been answered by 500,000 engines. "Yes," she said. "For the better." She could hear her mother in the background, saying something, and her father saying it's Lena, Ruthie, and the particular warmth of the kitchen in Kansas in the sound of their voices. "Come home soon," her father said. "Soon," she promised. She closed the comm. She looked at the stars through the viewport, at the ships, at the flag. She thought, of SY and JHY. From now on, nothing is the same. And she meant it, the whole weight of it, the gladness of it, and the responsibility of it, which is the thing about getting what you built for. You have to keep building. You always have to keep building. The stars were full of Terran Dreadnoughts. And the work was just beginning. The end,